Oh, good day to you. There are no boring days anymore, and it seems as though this might be an especially exciting one. And I was saying to producer Betsy Kaplan just a few minutes ago, we couldn't be in a better position right now. I mean, not as a democracy. As a democracy, we're completely screwed. I mean, our show, couldn't be in a better position because we just have just the right guests for just this moment and in a way that will cross over very neatly. So I'll tell you, in the second segment of the show today, we are going to have Leon Neyfakh. He has put together this remarkable and very addictive, I am here to tell you, podcast called Slow Burn, which is about Watergate. And really, every day that passes, as the Trump story gets more complicated and darker and more full of questions about who can hold a president accountable and when a society will make the decision to maybe turn away from its political leanings and towards the health of government, comparisons to Watergate become more and more germane. So, and when you listen to the podcast too, you just think, oh yeah, that's this, right? I'd forgotten. So anyway, he's coming up. But to set the stage, if there's anything even better than that, we've got Emily Bazelon, a lecturer at Yale Law School, staff writer for the New York Times, and the author of Sticks and Stones, Defeating the Culture of Bullying and Discovering the Power of Character and Empathy. She's a co-host on Slate's podcast Political Gabfest, another podcast I'm pretty addicted to. And in fact, they, in their most recent episode, were talking about exactly what we're going to talk about now. Although what we're going to talk about now just got more complicated, too. So we should say that Deputy Director Andrew McCabe of the FBI has either stepped down or been forced, according to one report, to step down. I will miss his glasses. They're really great FBI guy glasses. I'll probably miss our democracy even more, but when this whole thing plays out. But there's a lot more going on than that. So, Emily, first of all, you're joining us from the studios of Yale. Welcome aboard.
I am indeed. Thank you for having me. And I'm excited that you're about to have Leon on because I am also a big fan of Slow Burn.
Yeah, Slow Burn is great. And there's actually a lecturer in the poli-sci department at Yale who's assigned the entire podcast to his class.
That's excellent.
It's me, actually. So I guess we have to begin with, before this latest Monday morning flurry of stuff, we had a thing going on the political right that I think could be divided, that you guys tried on your podcast to kind of quantify and qualify at the end of last week. It sort of divides into two parts, right? One of them is this part that has words like secret society and maybe deep state and missing texts, although they are no longer missing attached to that. And that involves two people who were attached to Bob Mueller's team, but in fact haven't been attached to Bob Mueller's team for a long, long time, right?
That's right. And, I think that one way to think about all of this flurry, which, is centered on this secret memo that Devin Nunes in the House is started this Release the Memo campaign about, all of this is a giant distraction from Mueller's investigation and an attempt to derail it, and also to muddy the waters so that if Mueller does come up with evidence of crimes or misdeeds by President Trump and people around him, there will be kind of already a built-in resistance to believing all of that. And so if you think about that possible lens for viewing this other story, which is casting aspersions about the FBI, about the Justice Department, about everything connected to the Russia investigation, it gets easier to understand what the point is. Now, I should also say, like any set of accusations, we don't know what's behind it all, but it looks motivated by this quite sharp political and partisan motivation, and that's part of understanding it.
Right. So maybe one way to think about this, and to me, the Nunes memo is kind of the second part of it. The first part of it, and we can probably fold McCabe into it, is this notion that's being floated by conservative media and by some conservative members of Congress that there's just a political leaning to this whole investigation, that these two people who were texting back and forth, who were having an extramarital affair and therefore using their work phones to chit-chat a lot more than they used their private phones, were basically expressing depression. OMG, I'm so depressed about who was president, and that got kind of ginned up into a conversation about whether some of the people participating in an investigation of the Trump administration even though they're on the law enforcement side, have political leanings. Maybe you can add McCabe to that. His wife, Jill, had run for statewide office in Virginia and received money from people connected to the Clintons. Right? So, Emily, that's part of this. There's an argument being made that it's not just pure enforcement of the law. There's something else.
That's right. And then there are at least two parts to this. One is an attempt to discredit the FBI, right? And to argue that these kinds of political admissions in the text, particularly between, you're talking about FBI agent Pete Strzok and Lisa Page, who was a lawyer at the Justice Department, these kinds of admissions would have infected their work. So that's one question. Like, we don't expect every FBI agent and Justice Department lawyer not to vote, not to have any political opinions. But there's an assumption being made here that if they were expressing those opinions to each other, that must have influenced the investigation in a way that was biased against Trump, right? That's like an important part of this. And then moving on to McCabe, a further effort to discredit him. And then you start taking it high up into the FBI. And the timeline gets a little strange here because, the communications between Page and Strzok date from before the election, a time in which the FBI and the Justice Department, if anything, when you look at their actions, disclosed an investigation against Hillary Clinton, did not disclose an investigation into collusion potentially between the Trump campaign and Russia, right? So you have the FBI and the Justice Department actually taking actions that were not biased against Trump. So I feel like that's sort of some getting lost in the Republican conspiracy narrative that we're hearing.
Right. And right. In other words, at that point, if they were engaged in some kind of conspiracy to derail Donald Trump, they disguised it by appearing to do exactly the opposite, to upend the campaign of Hillary Clinton. I guess, and the other thing that we can say, and this is such an unusual thing, I mean, this is one of these things that I don't think really does have a parallel in Watergate or anything else. But this notion of discrediting the FBI, it's not particularly subtle, and it's coming from the very top. So we have the president of the United States tweeting in December that the FBI's, quote, reputation is in tatters, worst in history, exclamation point. Which is a strange thing for a chief executive to say about part of his own administration, that its reputation is in tatters. But Emily, that's not a subtle thing to be saying.
No, the opposite. And of course, there's an irony here, which is that often it's people on the left who are more suspicious about the law enforcement powers of the FBI. We have a history of J. Edgar Hoover, when he was the head of it, abusing his powers. And yet, here we have this Republican conservative president who is discrediting his own agency. Usually we think of presidents doing that at their own peril, and that does take us back to Nixon. But, Trump breaks a lot of rules and erodes a lot of norms. And so we're seeing that again here.
So now the second part of this, if this thing is enough of a thing to have parts, is this secret. And when we say secret memo that Devin Nunes is in possession of, increasingly I'm reminded of the words of Inigo Montoya. Oh, we don't have it. Never mind. He says, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. I mean, they keep calling it a secret memo, but I mean, everybody seems to know what's in the memo by this point. And Emily, one thing we know is that as of this morning anyway, the New York Times is saying that this memo in particular targets Rod Rosenstein, who's obviously Deputy Attorney General. So now you've got maybe even a pattern of like maybe beginning to pick off certain people. I mean, if McCabe is gone today and Rosenstein is part of what this memo is all about.
Right. I mean, one thing as I try to keep my eye on the ball here, it seems like there are a few people who are essential to rule of law, really, right? To the continuing of this investigation and it ending wherever it ends. And now I'm talking about Mueller's investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 campaign. And so if that is the main event, which I believe it should be, then Robert Mueller is essential and Rod Rosenstein is essential because he is the top official at the Justice Department who's overseeing that investigation in the wake of Attorney General Jeff Sessions' decision last year to recuse himself. And you can see why Trump and his allies would go after Rosenstein. And this secret but not so secret memo, which, the Justice Department says it would be extraordinarily reckless to release because it's based on classified information. And also it sounds like it's been cherry picked, looks like it's about to, I don't know if accuse is the right word because you have to buy into the idea that there is wrongdoing here. But the memo is partly about what's called a FISA application, a application of the FBI to conduct surveillance over Carter Page, who, of course, is one of the former Trump aides caught up in all of this. And so the news this morning was that Rosenstein had signed off on that application to the FISA court for surveillance as if there was something wrong with doing that. And that's going to be, I think, used as pressure on Rosenstein, I suppose. And this starts to get really pretty dangerous from the point of view of rule of law and kind of the test that the country passed during Watergate and that we're experiencing again.
Right. So, in a way that does segue to our eventual conversation with Leon, you have this moment where you're starting to see lines that appear to connect, and you wonder whether you're connecting them simply because it fits your own notion of what the narrative actually is, or because you're paranoid, or because they really do connect. So, really within, just a few days of learning also from the New York Times that last summer, President Trump ordered the firing of Robert Mueller. And I'm really careful about these verbs because I keep hearing people spin it as he was thinking about doing it. No, he wasn't thinking about doing it. He ordered it done, and Donald McGahn said he wouldn't do it. He'd quit rather than do it. So you've got that. And then you've got Rosenstein, who I assume is kind of the Elliot Richardson in this story. In other words, I assume, Emily, and you would know this far better than I, that if it ever came to that, he'd be asking Rosenstein to do the firing.
Yes, it does seem like, legally speaking, that's the way the chain of command works. There's some question about whether Trump could himself fire Mueller, but it certainly wouldn't be standing operating procedure. And so Rosenstein has been standing there, and has said publicly to Congress that he would not fire Mueller without good cause to do so, and that he doesn't see any such cause. And, these are the two officials who are, every day they go to work, showing that nobody in the United States is above the rule of law. And that is a basic precept of democracy. And whatever Mueller is finding out, we need to know the answer, and he needs to be able to finish doing his work.
So one of the things that I thought the three of you discussed very effectively last week is, there are these things that are being done, the impugning of the overall integrity of the effort, whether it's the impugning of the FBI or the trying to discredit Mueller or trying to discredit Rosenstein. We should say that, I don't know if we said it, but one of the things that's being at least breeded about is the idea that in the Nunes memo that Rosenstein's relying to a certain degree on material that was derived from the Christopher Steele investigation to get the FISA warrant on Carter Page. This is all like some Baroque novel, but
yes, seriously, the dossier. We should give it its Baroque novel name.
That's right, the proper name, the dossier. So there's you have all of that, and it seems as though there's this effort just to basically play defense in a situation where that's at least the reaction of some of the Republican Party and a lot of the conservative press. Although it's interesting how much of the conservative press, whether it's Bret Stephens or Charlie Sykes, there's a whole bunch of people in the conservative press who are not comfortable with what's happening right now.
They're the never-Trumpers, though, right? When you look at Fox and you look at what Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson or Fox and Friends folks are saying, they are on board.
But there's also the question of what happens when all of this is over somehow. And this is the thing that I think that you guys were palpating a little bit last week. And I think it's a really interesting question, which is if you ultimately succeed in eroding people's confidence in the FBI and the Justice Department, what have you won at the end of all this? Or maybe what are we inheriting at the end of all this?
Right. Well, if you're President Trump and what you care about is you and your family not being indicted and being able to walk away and say, we did nothing wrong, no money laundering, no collusion, no obstruction, then I'm not sure you really care about what damage you've done to the FBI in the medium to long term. If you're a citizen of the United States and you think that federal law enforcement needs investigators, then this is like a serious problem. And it is an amazing moment in which our chief executive does not seem concerned about that.
I guess one question that I have is there any way that, I guess maybe we have to wait for the Mueller report or wait for one of these committees to do something? There's no real Judge Sirica in this. There's nobody really kind of refereeing this or calling balls and strikes, right? It's sort of like that's the wrong sport. They're just these two football teams going at it, throwing whatever they've got at each other. I mean, is there any way that this can be refereed either by the judicial branch of government or by anybody else that you can think of?
Well, we haven't gotten to the judicial branch yet, right? I mean, there are a number of ways in which judges and the courts could become relevant. So one would be Mueller tries to indict more people. I mean, we do have the courts overseeing the indictments that he's already filed, but obviously there are other people who could be indicted. So that is one way the courts factor in. Another would be that Trump engineers Mueller's firing, and then the first institution that will be at the center next is actually Congress, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it is the second branch that should be playing a key oversight role here. And then you will have questions about legislation to protect Mueller or, reappoint him. And then potentially, the kind of clash and constitutional crisis that does involve the courts. My fear is that this Congress will not be willing to play that role. And so it will be hard to get the courts involved because you have Congress rolling over and being supine. That they're the ones who, in addition to Mueller and this investigation in the executive branch, they are the ones to look to here for accountability.
Right. I mean, and in his public utterances, I mean, Mitch McConnell has kind of waved away most of this stuff. I mean, most of the concern, anyway, about what's happening here. And it does seem, if they were able to use somehow this Nunes memo to get Rosenstein out and already having gotten McCabe out, this kind of notion of picking off some of these stand-up guys who maybe belong to a certain kind of tradition within the Justice Department, getting rid of those people and maybe being able to replace them with more cooperative kinds of people. That's alarming to some of us. But if it's not alarming to McConnell and to Ryan and to the people they command, I would just think, as you're suggesting, that this year, 2018, will pass with Congress doing essentially nothing.
Right. And that will be, I would say, enormous disappointment. Again, not from a partisan standpoint so much as just, the basic functioning of our institutions. The remedy for that, the most obvious remedy, is not necessarily the courts. It's the 2018 elections.
It's the 2018 elections. And I guess I would also ask you, we're talking to Emily Bazelon, by the way, whether or not you can imagine another kind of tipping point. So, I mean, go back to Watergate for a second. So we know that, we know from Leon that, for example, Howard Baker, who kind of emerged as a Republican with a conscience in this process, but his first reaction as the committee convened was to go and meet privately with Nixon and say, you don't have to worry about this. This isn't going to be a big problem. And at some point, Howard Baker either couldn't live with his own conscience or couldn't live with public opinion as it shifted on this. I mean, can you imagine a scenario where, absent a change in the majorities in Congress, but simply because those people will not be sworn in for another year, just because of the way the fact pattern is going, or because Trump really does fire Mueller, that maybe some of these people begin to reverse themselves?
I mean, I think it's possible. I certainly want to hold out the hope for it because I think it's so important institutionally. I don't think it's obvious. And there are a couple of factors that I think we've touched on a little bit, but are different between Watergate and now. I mean, one is the rise of conservative media, the degree to which an alternative set of facts is available to Trump's base. And another is this question again about Trump's popularity, right? So one thing that's crucial about the timeline for Watergate is that it's not until Nixon's approval rating fell from the 70s or 80s among Republicans to around 55 that impeachment became a real possibility. And we have not seen that kind of drop in Trump's approval ratings among Republicans and his base. And then that ties back into the way in which conservative media and the sort of conspiracy, distraction, throw all the spaghetti at the wall, Devin Nunes tactic is taking effect.
That the point you make about conservative media is really one worth spending a moment on because, in fact, yes, they can keep a story like this going. They can keep it alive. They can push it. And they can build out from it, too. They can make it a much more Baroque cathedral. And so, you got Rush Limbaugh's immediate reaction was that, yes, this is the deep state at work. And this deep state is probably the same deep state, he really said this, by the way, that provided George W. Bush with false intelligence about Iraq so that he would lead a charge into Iraq and ultimately discredit himself. And Rush had that thing, it was ready on a hair trigger, this kind of crazy connection. And there have been a lot of those kinds of things. And if if you're dumb enough to be like me and write a newspaper column and then read the comments you get, you see that there's a lot of people who see this not simply as some kind of conspiracy by a bunch of people in the FBI and the Justice Department and a few retired people from those institutions, but all of those people wrapped together with the Clintons and President Obama. It's like all one big thing that connects to lots of other stuff. And that where that used to be a fringe idea, Emily, it now has a much larger constituency.
That is my guess. That is a concern. And I think connected to all of this is this question of, once you start, I'm about to mix metaphors, forgive me, but once you start going down these rabbit holes, you're not actually on defense anymore. You're on offense. You have your own set of charges that you're hurling, and you're asking for people to, take your suspicions seriously. And until, the 50,000 texts reappear, the suspicion, you want everyone to suspect that they were zapped away by the Justice Department, right? It's this idea that you're making accusations that the media then spends a lot of time chasing after, as opposed to just defending Trump and his aides from the attacks of the investigation, based on what we've learned so far.
All right. I think we've succeeded in making everybody's heads spin sufficiently. So Emily Bazelon, lecturer at Yale Law School, staff writer for the New York Times, and the author of Sticks and Stones, Defeating the Culture of Bullying and Rediscovering the Power of Character and Empathy, co-host on Slate's podcast, Political Gabfest. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Colin.
All right. And thanks to our friends down in the Yale studio for getting Emily on the air with us. We're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to introduce you to this host of the podcast that Emily and I keep talking about.
Sitting on the throne tonight. It kind of feels like a coup d'etat, but it's gonna be huge, world. 'Cause the man in the tinfoil hat is gonna drain the swamp tonight and fill it up with alternative facts. And it's gonna be great, tremendous, amazing, and all that.
All right. Welcome back to the Scramble. We are, as usual, scrambling around on Monday, although I think today we really felt as though we had, or we have, a game plan that kind of makes some sense. And it made some sense to us even at the end of last week when I said to Betsy Kaplan, the producer, I really want to tie in this Watergate thing. I really want to talk particularly about this podcast where they're walking people through the steps of Watergate. And that was even before some of the things that happened over the weekend where, I just feel with each passing day, there's a way in which we make more connections to Watergate. So we're going to have Leon Neyfakh on just a second. I think we might be having a little bit of trouble making that connection right now. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what's coming up. I guess maybe the first thing that I will tell you, though, is that if you get interested, which I hope you will, in what we're talking about, and I've mentioned this at other times on other shows. I've mentioned it on The Wheelhouse. This is part of the Slate family of podcasts. Once again, it's called Slow Burn. And once you start listening to it, you're going to do what I do anyway, which is to eagerly anticipate the dropping of each new episode. And so before we before we even bring Leon into the conversation, I want to just show you the way that it's happening now, because really, particularly over this weekend, in columns by Charles Blow and Greg Sargent, and in conversations on the air, you're really starting to hear more and more of this this comparison. So here's Meet the Press this weekend. This is Tom Brokaw talking about the story the New York Times reported. You heard Emily Bazelon and I discussing this, that last week the New York Times reported that during the summer, President Trump ordered the firing of Robert Mueller, and Donald McGahn, who is sort of maybe the John Dean person in this particular hierarchy, said no, that he would resign rather than do this. This is how Brokaw, who's an old hand obviously, is processing that.
I was here for the Saturday Night Massacre, and the Nixon White House thought that that was really going to unleash their ability to deal with what was going on. And it was another nail in the coffin. There ought to be a lesson in all of that.
Did they really think at the time? I mean, we look back and realize what a catastrophic error that was. Yeah. They really think at the time that was going to...
They thought that was the right thing to do, that their base would support them in it, and that the president had a legal grounds for doing what he did.
So, Leon Neyfakh, this is all not news to you anymore. Although I've been listening to Slow Burn since it went on the air. I listened to the first episode right around the time that it dropped. And the way that you were kind of presenting yourself is as a person, I'm assuming, I don't even know how old you are, but I think you're young enough so that you're kind of learning about this, not having lived through it, but looking back and sort of seeing what we all lived through during that time.
That's right. Yeah, I'm 32, and not only am I 32, I also had a pretty bare understanding of Watergate going into this. It was limited pretty much to all the president's men. So yeah, I had a lot to learn, and I think it gave me sort of I'd like to think, a fresh perspective on all the stuff that I read about and talked to my interview subjects about.
There are going to be 8 episodes. I've listened to 7 so far, plus a 9th bonus episode pastiche of some of the stuff that you've reserved for Slate Plus subscribers. Is there a way in which that you're telling a slightly different story than you expected to tell? How did the story mutate as you got to know it better?
Yeah, well, so I guess the first mutation was just to my level of enthusiasm for this, because when the idea first came up, I thought, really going to do a Watergate story? Like everyone already knows Watergate. Everyone knows, how it ended and what's really the point of going over it again. And then, like, as soon as I read, the first book about it that I read, which was Nightmare by J. Anthony Lucas, and as soon as I watched a couple of documentaries, I realized there was just so much I didn't know, and so much that I think people my age, and even people who lived through it, who may have forgotten a lot of these subplots and details. So that was sort of the first eureka moment, was realizing that there was a lot here to excavate and present to audiences that would be new, even if it wasn't exactly breaking news. And so as far as how my understanding of Watergate itself mutated, I guess I'd say that I didn't quite have an appreciation for how many different institutions had to participate and do their part for the conclusion to arrive. I think, I think looking back on history, you sort of impose a degree of inevitability to things that actually occurred, and you don't necessarily wonder about, sort of forks in the road where things could have gone differently, and I've definitely become more attuned to those forks in the road with the Watergate story.
Yeah, I just do your first point. I have to say, so I'm a very different age from you. I was 18 years old and in college when Watergate really started to heat up. So in the spring and summer of '73, early summer, I was in my freshman year in college. My freshman counselor was Gary Trudeau, who was already a successful political cartoonist at the time. So I had a really good seat on all this. Nonetheless, I could not successfully, and I've kind of stayed with this, but it's a very difficult story to tell, even if you do think you know it, even if you think you lived through it. Michael Schudson's terrific book on Watergate and collective memory makes that point, that the average person who thinks that he or she lived through Watergate couldn't tell the story very effectively, because it's a complicated story and one with so many moving parts that people think they know it, and they don't.
Yeah, one of our goals was sort of to try to put ourselves in the heads of people who lived through it, and to try to try to tell the story without a whole lot of foreshadowing, without a lot of without trying to limit the information we're deploying at various parts in the plot to whatever was known at the time, so that we can sort of capture the sense of surprise that people had when this or that occurred.
So one of the big questions that you explore early on is the question of when did people in sufficient numbers, in significant numbers, begin to know and care about this. And one of the points that you make that I think people have forgotten is that Bob Woodward and Leslie Stahl, whom you interview extensively, had been doing some reporting on this for their respective employers, but it really wasn't getting a whole lot of traction. It was really kind of a niche story. And then at a certain point, Walter Cronkite, and there was just nobody who had more clout. Walter Cronkite had a kind of clout at that time as the CBS Evening News anchor that nobody has today. Nobody has this kind of gravitas or just omnipresence in the media. So he decides it's an important story. He does this whole series of evening newscasts where he blows out an almost unprecedented amount of time and uses infographics to try to explain this complicated story. And Leon, what happens at the end of all that?
Nixon gets reelected in a landslide, the biggest landslide I think of all time, and it was I think it was really frustrating for the reporters who could sense that there was something big here. Not just Woodward and Bernstein, but as you said, Leslie Stahl at CBS. There were reporters at Time magazine. There were a couple of reporters at the LA Times who were working on it. To them, I think it was clear that there was something. This was a tip of an iceberg. And I think they just didn't quite have enough time, and didn't find out quite enough by the time the election happened for it to make a difference. And there were polls that showed that some significant percentage of Americans hadn't even really heard of Watergate when they voted in November. As you say, Cronkite was sort of the last chance. I forget exactly when his specials aired, but I think it was like a few days before the election, and it was just a little bit too late by that point, I think.
Right. So I think one of the things that becomes more and more clear, and this is a point that other people have made, including Michael Schudson, is that probably because of All the President's Men and some other stuff, we tend to overstate the role of the press in all of this. And that if we start looking for turning points, I'm persuaded that James McCord, when he reaches out to Judge Sirica, that might be, you can't just have the press reporting stuff all the time and not have substance going on in the world of actors, players in this particular drama, right? So when McCord contacts Sirica, to me, Leon, that's one of the points where this story is about to take a pretty hard turn towards more seriousness.
I totally agree. I think the McCord letter in which he alerts Judge Sirica that there had been perjury committed during McCord's trial, and that there were higher ups whose names hadn't been uttered in connection with the burglary. And that there had been efforts made to, silence people. When that letter is read in court, there's a hush that sort of goes over the courtroom, and it's after that I think that things really start moving. That said, McCord sent that letter, many think, because Sirica was threatening him with I think it's like a 35-year sentence, something insane. Sirica was a really tough judge. Some people say he, his toughness bordered on the unethical at times. But his Sirica's rage at the possibility of a cover-up was what I think prompted McCord to write the letter. And I think you can't discount necessarily the role of the press in forming Sirica's views, right? So all these things sort of feed on each other, and part of the challenge here has been sort of trying to separate out the cause and effect and trying to figure out how much what is it that exactly moves public opinion and what creates public pressure, I think the press obviously has a huge role in setting the public setting public opinion, it just I just don't think it was as decisive maybe as it looks in all the president's men.
Right. Having lived very closely through coverage of the impeachment of a governor here in Connecticut, or the near impeachment of a governor and his resignation here in Connecticut, I mean, I've come to believe that it's a very synergistic relationship. The press can pump life into a story and keep people enthusiastic or attentive to it, but you really need these investigators, these people on the ground, many of whom, among the survivors anyway, the ones still living, you talked to. Those are the people who they have to sort of dig up an awful lot of the stuff that only they can dig up. And if you take either one of them out of the equation, I think people lose the thread.
That's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think a bunch of the stories that Woodward and Bernstein wrote, certainly not all of them, but a bunch of them were based on investigative work that the FBI was doing in those first couple of months. I think there's questions about how far maybe the FBI would have gone if things had been different, but it remains true that a lot of the sort of most explosive scoops that were published in the Post were the result of leaks from the FBI, as we now know, with Mark Felt being deep throat.
So, one of the things that Emily and I were just talking about in the first segment is, what does create turning points? What might create enough public pressure so that people from a president's own party would begin to question whether or not he should stay in office or whether some pretty drastic steps have to be taken. But one of the things that you sketch out really well is how long people were willing to hang in there. Past at least the revelation of the existence of the tapes and Nixon's refusal to release the tapes, you had some pretty significant holdouts. We're going to hear from your podcast, Slow Burn, we're going to hear somebody who's now a rather revered figure, George H.W. Bush, but was Republican national chairman, I believe, at the time. This is how he was handling it.
The chairman of the Republican National Committee at the time was George H.W. Bush. Here's Bush speaking to a gathering of Southern Republicans in Atlanta in December of 1973.
The people are going to tell their members of Congress. The people are going to tell their members of the United States Senate. Let the man do the job he was elected to do.
And so that was pretty late into the process, Leon, right? And that was, I think, in the fall, maybe, of 2003.
Not 2003. 73.
I'm sorry. I just think I'm in 2003. Yeah, it's in the fall of 1973. So you've got, you got still then, and so by that time there really is an awful lot of snow piling up at the door.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, by that point, we already knew that the White House was bugged. Essentially, we knew that Nixon had created recordings of many conversations, possibly all conversations that he'd had in the Oval Office and elsewhere. And, I think what I kind of concluded was that Nixon's refusal to release any of those tapes in the months following that revelation in July of 73 started to bother people, including Republicans. Goldwater was one of the first people to sort of, say that the president really ought to, put it all on the table with these tapes. And, of course, Goldwater later became a decisive voice in convincing Nixon that he had to resign. But there were plenty of holdouts. I mean, the episode that's going up tomorrow that covers the impeachment proceedings in the House of Representatives and Nixon's eventual resignation talks about how the members of the House Judiciary Committee, the 38-member body that was carrying out the impeachment inquiry, there were liberals and conservatives on that committee who were not that they were sure how they were going to vote before anything, before they heard any evidence, but they were certainly leaning in one way or the other. And I think the story of the House Judiciary Committee sort of shows how how long people will stand by their man if it's a matter of tribal allegiances.
Right. And so to that point, okay, so I said before it's a synergistic relationship between the press and the people doing the actual investigations. I think there's some other things that are required to create a moment like the one that Watergate became. I think one of them is there has to be at least some somebody, maybe a few people, to whom people can attach certain heroic aspirations or heroic qualities, or even just qualities of likability, and whether or not they're completely warranted or not is beside the point. So, I mean, I think having a Sam Ervin, who you spend quite a bit of time on, and even interview a guy who started a Sam Ervin fan club, which just really took off and became incredibly popular. So maybe just for people as young as you who are listening, explain who Sam Ervin is.
So Sam Ervin was the chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee, and he presided over the month-long televised hearings that I think brought forward a lot of the most salacious and kind of shocking revelations that anyone had heard up to that point. The hearings were a total national phenomenon. I mean, people were glued to their TVs watching it. I interviewed a family that I'm going to publish tomorrow as a Slate Plus extra. It's three siblings who watched the hearings together and made a scrapbook that they still have, in which there are like little jokes written about all the different members, including Ervin. This was a really big part of their lives, and Ervin, I think, became a real icon, especially for people who wanted to see Nixon punished for his misdeeds. He sort of was the voice of decency. I think he was a voice of constitution, admiration for the Constitution. He was a constitutional lawyer or rather, he was someone who loved the Constitution. He carried a pocket Constitution in his pocket that he would wave at witnesses during the hearings, and he had this accent, sort of Southern accent that people really liked, and I think it, as I talk about in the episode, it obscured some of his other views that people on the left would not have gone along with, and most importantly, that he was a segregationist.
Yeah, pretty horrible segregationalist. But he had, as you're suggesting, a twinkle in his eye, and that ultimately helped a lot. And I feel as though if we're living in some kind of parallel Watergate universe right now, I don't see the Sam Ervin. I don't see the person that people kind of love. I mean, Chuck Schumer is not Sam Ervin. It just sort of doesn't. I don't see that person. The other thing that you have to have, that you had to have in Watergate, and you have now as well, because you need the synergy between the press and the investigators. You maybe need a charismatic prosecutor or prosecutor surrogate. And then I think you need a lot of help from the guy himself. And Nixon gave the world a lot of help. And President Trump seems to be trying to help the world impeach him every single day, and also trying to undermine efforts to impeach him. But, I mean, I think you'd agree, Leon, if Nixon doesn't make those tapes and doesn't talk the way he talks in those tapes, he finishes out his second term.
I think that's right. It was a total self-inflicted wound, and I think historians still debate what moved him to install that taping system, what convinced him not to destroy the tapes once they were revealed. I think if people hadn't, so the transcripts of a bunch of the conversations were released under pressure in April of '74, just a few months before the resignation. And when people read those transcripts, including all the famous expletive deleted notations, they were really stunned, and they saw a side of the president that they hadn't seen before. Unlike Trump, I think Nixon was really good at presenting himself as presidential, as a very serious, deliberative man. Whereas in private, as people learned when they read these transcripts, he was sort of constantly scheming, constantly talking about not what was right and what was wrong, but how do we get away with this? How do we get away with that? How do we, beat this back? How do we stonewall these people or get them off our backs? It showed that the White House was being run like a criminal conspiracy. It was being run like a criminal gang, basically, more so than a government.
Right. I mean, it was a more innocent time, too. I can tell you that the notion that the president would use a word like bastard, I remember now we would be thrilled if President Trump would tone it down all the way to words like bastard. But the notion that a president would say something like that in the Oval Office, it shocked people. Expletive deleted became kind of a meme, kind of a trope,
Totally.
All the ways in which those things had to be sort of squelched from the transcript, because the world, America couldn't couldn't even handle the idea of a president who talked like that. People were genuinely troubled and shocked by that. Well, first of all, I want to say that, so you have do you have a big thing coming up in Washington with Dick Cavett? Has that already happened, or are you?
No, that's on February 8th. Yeah, it's going to be Dick Cavett, Leslie Stahl, Evan Thomas, and Susan Glasser. A panel discussion at the Watergate Hotel, actually.
Well, that'll be a lot of fun. I should tell you that at Yale, there's a political science seminar, which is being assigned the whole podcast to listen to.
You're joking, really?
Yeah, I teach it, so I'm not joking.
Okay. That's amazing. Thank you.
You want to come to class? It's February 27th. Anyway, we got to go right now, but Leon Nafok, first of all, the podcast, Slow Burn, it's terrific stuff. It's addictive. Thank you for doing it. I hope people listen.
Thank you so much.
All right, we're going to take a little break. We'll come back, and I will kind of wrap things up in my inimitable and ever-beloved fumbling way.
Because we'll blow the whistle on you. Just like we did the Watergate.
Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolfe, with special help from E. Howard Hunt and James McCord. Amanda Fish belongs to the secret society Duck and Cover. The part of Bill Curry was played by Lowell Weicker. On tomorrow's show, we're in New Haven to answer the question, what's it like to be a bee? And now, back to Colin.
Yes, what's it like indeed. All right, so I've just got a few minutes left here. We planned it that way. And I just want to say something quickly about the arts. These are troubling times. Very troubling times for a lot of the reasons that we just covered. And the arts are one of the things that we turn to console us or to point us towards greater meaning. But the arts are very troubled right now, too. So last night, I'm not making this up, last night I was having dinner. We were having dinner with a friend of ours, and our friend brought up, he said, tell me how you're thinking about this. So this whole question of how you separate the art from the artist if the artist has troubling tendencies. So we're going through a lot of this right now. And so I said, well, ultimately you have to ask yourself, to what degree are you willing to interrogate every single piece of art and every single artist? I mean, by artist, I mean novelist, poet, dramatist, painter, sculptor, composer, any kind of artist. To what degree are you willing to fully interrogate the question of that person's moral qualities, whether that person is living or dead, right? Because it's complicated. And ultimately, there are people that we have some remove from. I said all this at the table. I said, ultimately, there are people like Picasso. Picasso was not a nice person. He was really horrible to women. So there's somebody like that who, on the other hand, we have some remove, and maybe we can kind of make a decision about that based on just that. I said, to me, the other question is the person's work full of the problem that they represent? So, for example, with Leni Riefenstahl or D.W. Griffith, the work that they created contains the problem of their character, their ideas, their off-screen, so to speak, behavior. So they're a bigger problem maybe than Picasso. But anyway, we had this very interesting conversation, and then I pick up the New York Times this morning, and there's this article about the fact that they are, first of all, I think it's the National Gallery is pulling a Chuck Close retrospective because there are, in fact, some sexual harassment allegations against him. But they go into this whole question, and in many cases these days, when there's a portrait exhibited, if it's a portrait of somebody who's problematic, if the sitter for the portrait is problematic, they'll have like a little label explaining why he's problematic. And now they really are starting to look at people like Picasso. So it's happening. That's all I'm saying. So I wanted to end on a happier note than that, and with somebody maybe it's sad because she just died over the weekend, but she lived a great life. She was a terrific singer. Her name was Marlene Verplank. She was the kind of singer who could sing a song the way it was meant to be sung. This is from a Johnny Mercer album she put out a long, long time ago, which I owned on vinyl. So just end with her singing this great song in a very great way. And as far as I know, there's no label we have to put up next to it. Marlene was just kind of a nice person who could sing well.
I do, didn't you know? I remember too a distant bell and stars that fell like rain out of the blue. When my life is through and the angels ask me to recall I remember too a distant bell and stars that fell like rain out of the blue. When my life is through and the angels ask me to recall the thrill of them all, then I shall tell them I remain